My name is Kellen Johansson. I have the honor of introducing our next speaker in this symposium. I am a political science major and a member of the class of 2018. I am joined by Kyler Smith, who will be moderating the question and answer section after the lecture. Kyler Smith is a finance major and also a member of the class of 2018. Our next lecture will be presented by Professor Diana Schaub. Professor Schaub teaches political science at Loyola University Maryland. She received her AB from Kenyon College, where she was elected to the Pi Beta Kappa, and an MA and PhD from the University of Chicago. She is the author of Erotic Liberalism and dozens of scholarly essays. Professor Schaub's work has also appeared in the National Affairs, the Criterion, the Public Interest, the American Enterprise, the Claremont Review of Books, Commentary, First Things, the American Interest, and City Journal. Please join me in welcoming Professor Diana Schaub to Linfield.
I talked this morning about Frederick Douglass and his view of Abraham Lincoln. Any man can say things that are true of Abraham Lincoln, but no man can say anything that is new of Abraham Lincoln. That observation was made by Frederick Douglass in his great Oration in memory of Lincoln, delivered in 1876 upon the dedication of the Freedmen's Monument. It's still the case today. Not even by resorting to lies and untruths can one find anything new to say about Abraham Lincoln. The truths and untruths, and maybe most common the half-truths, have all been around a long time. The task is thus not to be original in one's appreciation, but to be just. Proper appreciation of Lincoln's statesmanship, particularly in his lifetime, was rare. The contrast with George Washington is instructive. Although both experts and ordinary citizens now routinely consider Washington and Lincoln the greatest of American presidents, Washington's rank as a statesman was clear and uncontested from the first. So uncontested that his election to the presidency was unanimous, while the election of Lincoln was so contentious as to provoke civil war. In addition to the seditious opposition of the South, Lincoln encountered plenty of loyal opposition in the North, not only from Democrats, but from those more radical than he, both within the Republican Party and outside it, among the various strains of abolitionism. Radicals, then and now, have been particularly stinting in their praise of Lincoln. Some today suggest that credit for emancipation belongs more to those like Frederick Douglass, who pressured Lincoln to take that decisive step. At the extreme, this position asserts that Lincoln was anti-black, that the proclamation was basically a fraud, and that Lincoln does not deserve any credit for emancipation since he was forced into glory. Before signing on to that contemporary radical critique, we might want to examine what the greatest of the abolitionists himself had to say about Lincoln. From his newspaper editorials before and during the war to his speeches and personal reminiscences after the war, the trajectory of Frederick Douglass's thinking about Lincoln is one of increasing and deepening appreciation, often revising his own earlier negative assessments. Perhaps because Douglass was self-educated, he remained a lifelong learner, capable of open-minded and rigorous reconsiderations. The way in which the exercise of his critical faculties could lead him to substantive reevaluations was evident early in his career when he dramatically changed his opinion, 180-degree about-face, about the status of slavery under the Constitution. Repudiating the Garrisonian view of the pro-slavery character of the Constitution, Douglass embraced an anti-slavery reading of the document, thereby transforming himself from a revolutionary intent on annulling the Constitution and turning himself into a reformer, still fiercely critical of American practice, but ever after a staunch defender of America's founding principles. A parallel but more subtle shift occurred as a result of Douglass's encounter with Lincoln, an encounter that taught him to appreciate the statesman, which is to say the prudent politician, as well as the John Browns of the world. So Douglass learned to love Lincoln, and in his 1876 Oration in memory of Lincoln, he recapitulated that intellectual and emotional journey for the benefit of all Americans. As befitted the ceremonial nature of the occasion, Douglass's speech expressed gratitude toward Lincoln. But more intriguingly, it reflected on the political significance of gratitude. So the speech is both of gratitude, a speech of gratitude, and a speech about gratitude. Douglas says that the sentiment of gratitude, which perpetuates the memories of great public men, is, quote, one of the noblest that can stir and thrill the human heart. Further, he points out that with the dedication of the Freedmen's Monument, on your screens there, this was a monument that was funded by donations raised entirely among the newly emancipated race. And with the dedication of this monument, Douglas says, Black Americans now, for the first time in the history of our people, join in this high worship. Douglas wants the world to notice what we, the colored people, are doing in honoring Abraham Lincoln. As he explains, first things are always interesting, and this is one of our first things. Douglas presents the Black commemoration of Lincoln as an act that honors the honorees, that honors the honorers almost as much as it honors the honoree. Now, the story of how this memorial took the shape that it did, and Douglas's role in ensuring that his people's first national act came off well, is fascinating. Douglas was asked in 1865, almost right after the assassination, to lend his name to the Educational Monument Association. That association proposed to raise money from blacks and whites alike to build a black college in honor of Lincoln's memory. Douglas refused to participate in the project. Here's what he wrote in his letter to the organizers. For a monument by itself and upon its own merits, I say good. For a college by itself and upon its own merits, I say good. But for a college monument or a monument college, I do not say good. The whole scheme is derogatory to the character of the colored people of the United States. It looks to me like an attempt to wash the black man's face in the nation's tears for Abraham Lincoln. I am for washing the black man's face, that is, educating his mind, for that is a good thing to be done. And I appreciate the nation's tears for Abraham Lincoln, but I am not so enterprising as to think of turning the nation's veneration for our martyred president into a means of advantage to the colored people and of sending around the hat to a mourning public. Douglas doesn't want gratitude, which he calls one of the holiest sentiments of the human heart, to be contaminated with blatant self-interest. For gratitude isn't even gratitude then. In the proposed college monument, the problem of impure motives would have been even worse, since there would not just be a mixture of motives, but an actual division of motives along racial lines. Whites would be doing the creditable giving, and blacks the self-interested taking. Douglas did not want blacks to enter upon citizenship in the role of recipients. Now, Douglas was not in principle opposed to white philanthropy on behalf of blacks. Years earlier, he had sketched a plan for an industrial college in answer to an inquiry from Harriet Beecher Stowe. She wanted to know what she could do to contribute to black advancement. However, Douglas was always sensitive to the dangers of ill-timed or overly intrusive assistance that could have the perverse effect of sapping black initiative, thereby impeding the long-term prospects of the race. Douglas worried that there was always more of benevolence and pity rather than straightforward justice in white America's dealings with blacks. His preference, it seems to me, was for justice, sternly and blindly equal, with no special pleading or privileges. This leads to what at first might seem a contradiction in Douglas's reaction to the Monument College project. I think, as is well known, Douglas's vision of America was fundamentally and quite radically integrationist. Nonetheless, he wants the monument to be exclusively a black effort. However humble, he says, it should be our own act and deed. On the other hand, when it comes to the idea of a college, Douglas speaks against not only this self-serving hybrid, the Monument College, but also against the idea of any college being built for the permanent and exclusive use of blacks. So, he's in favor of a separately erected monument, but opposed to a separate college. Why a freedman's memorial, but not a freedman's college? What accounts for the different judgments on these two endeavors? The explanation, I think, hinges on the nature of the two undertakings and their potential contribution to either lessening racial prejudice or prolonging it. A display of gratitude by Black Americans, reflecting the special sentiments they bear towards Lincoln, would undercut white prejudice by showing Blacks capable of the holiest sentiments of the human heart. Conversely, a college explicitly and exclusively reserved to Blacks, whoever foots the bill for it, by accommodating race prejudice, in effect bolsters it. Thus, Douglass accepts all Black institutions only with great reluctance and always with the proviso that as soon as circumstances permit, Blacks must make their way into majority institutions. So I think Douglass is consistent in that he judges instances of racial solidarity and instances of group action by their effects on friendship between the races. His guiding question is always, does the doing of this deed point us toward the overcoming of race prejudice and contribute to an ethos of common citizenship? Acts of Black self-reliance, both individual and group-based, can create the conditions for non-racial brotherhood. Douglass understood that before the Black man can be recognized as a brother, he must be recognized as a man. Manliness precedes fraternity. Or to give it a non-gendered formulation, independence precedes friendship. As Douglass had hoped, the Monument College plan was abandoned, and in the end, the memorial took the pure form that he had recommended, with Douglass himself delivering the keynote address. Not surprisingly, the first paragraph of the address refers to the manly pride with which Blacks should view the occasion, while the final paragraph sets forth the Black claim to human brotherhood. More especially, Douglass informs those whites who seek to scourge Blacks beyond the range of human brotherhood that the Freedmen's Monument stands as a refutation of their blighting slander. In between that opening invocation of manliness or independence and the closing invocation of brotherhood or friendship, the speech itself demonstrates how a still very divided nation could develop a shared perspective on the achievements of Abraham Lincoln. So I might hazard the following comparison. What Lincoln's Gettysburg Address did for the Union, Douglass's Oration on Lincoln did or sought to do for racial union. Now, any analysis of the speech must take into account not only the uniqueness of the occasion, but the rhetorical dilemma posed by the larger historical moment. Remember, this is 1876. Reconstruction period is coming to an end. Federal government is increasingly reluctant to enforce the 14th and 15th Amendments. Douglass is very worried about the resurgent spirit of the Old South. He's worried that reconciliation between Northern whites and Southern whites could end up excluding the freedmen and erasing the real meaning of the Civil War. So what he attempts to do is to use the memory of Lincoln to counteract that dangerous tendency and to revive the possibility for the new birth of freedom. The oration has a very careful structure. It's composed of 8 distinct sections. Each of these sections begins with what the grammarians call a vocative expression. In the first, if you know what the vocative is, you'll know what that means. In the first 2 sections, this will give you a clue. In the first 2 sections, he addresses friends and fellow citizens. In the subsequent 6 sections, simply fellow citizens. Now, politicians, of course, rely on direct address of this sort. It becomes even a kind of verbal tic. Think about Lyndon Johnson. I can't imitate the accent, but Lyndon Johnson peppering his speeches with "my fellow Americans." Douglass's iterations, however, I think are much more deliberate. It's not just a verbal tic. Every time he has one of these vocative expressions, it signals a new phase in the argument that delineates the different but not irreconcilable claims of whites and Blacks to the memory of Lincoln. So Douglas begins the oration, by addressing his immediate audience, those who assembled that day in Lincoln Park, due east of the Capitol building, on the 11th anniversary of Lincoln's assassination. The audience was a large and racially mixed one. 25,000 ordinary citizens, many of them African Americans, the majority of them African Americans, along with numerous representatives of official Washington. It was actually declared a federal holiday, the day on which this statue was dedicated. Douglas mentions the presence of members of the House of Representatives and the Senate, the presence of the Chief Justice and the entire Supreme Court, and the presence of the President himself. These attendees deserve to be called not just fellow citizens, but friends. Their attendance gives evidence of their sympathies. Interestingly, this first section of the speech makes no mention at all of Lincoln, but instead congratulates you, a pronoun that seems to refer, at least initially, only to Douglas's fellow blacks. Thus, he speaks of our condition as a people and the remarkable progress in that condition. The evidence of progress, which Douglas says is a credit to American civilization, provides the occasion for a shift from you to congratulating all. Douglas notes that this new dispensation of freedom has come both to our white fellow citizens and ourselves. The second section of the speech acknowledges especially the federal government and the friendly role that it has played in this new dispensation. The erection of the memorial received congressional approval. The pedestal for the statue, unlike the statue itself, was paid for by congressional appropriation, and as I mentioned, the day itself was declared a federal holiday. Douglas, however, highlights the awful sacrifice that lies behind this federal friendship. This section contains Douglas's first mention of Lincoln, whom he calls the first martyr president of the United States. Moreover, Lincoln's martyrdom is presented as the climax of the larger national sacrifice to which Douglas alludes with his reference to yonder heights of Arlington. Arlington Cemetery was visible from Lincoln Park, and 16,000 Civil War soldiers are buried there, including 1,500 black troops. On the 11th anniversary of Lincoln's death, what Douglas wanted to remind his audience of was blood-bought freedom, our blood-bought freedom, in which we, the colored people, rejoice. While Douglas emphasizes the sentiment of appreciation that gives rise to monuments like the one being unveiled, curiously, he says nothing about the actual statue. It's known that he was not altogether pleased with the design, which shows Lincoln, Emancipation Proclamation in one hand, standing over the crouching figure of a slave. Dissatisfaction with the sculpture was apparently not limited to Douglas, but was shared by other African Americans. The official program for the festivities attempted to address these objections, explaining that, quote, in the original design, the kneeling slave was represented as perfectly passive, receiving freedom from the hand of the great liberator. But the artist justly changed this to bring the presentation nearer to the historical fact by making the emancipated slave an agent in his own deliverance. He is accordingly represented as exerting his own strength with strained muscles in breaking the chain which had bound him. The brochure also mentions that there was an alternative design by a female sculptor, Harriet Hosmer, which had to be rejected as too costly. It would have depicted Lincoln atop a central pillar, flanked by smaller pillars, showing, among other figures, black Union soldiers. Douglas would certainly have preferred that design, since it embodied his famous aphorism. This is a line from Lord Byron that Douglas repeated in almost every speech he ever gave. The line goes like this: "Hereditary bondsmen, know ye not, who would be free themselves must strike the blow." In a sense, Douglas's speech corrects the submissiveness and the paternalism of the statue, because Douglas acknowledges both our loyal, brave, and patriotic soldiers and the vast, high, and preeminent services rendered to ourselves, to our race, to our country, and to the whole world by Abraham Lincoln. In other words, Douglass's praise of Lincoln is balanced by his recognition of the black contribution to emancipation. Having spent the opening two sections proclaiming the generous deed of the moment and commending it to the notice of men of all parties and opinions, including, quote, those who despise us, Douglass in the third section begins to speak to the larger nationwide audience, an audience of fellow citizens, not all of whom are necessarily friends. And the word friends drops from the vocative expression. Douglass now treads very carefully. He does not want the black embrace of Lincoln to trigger a white flight from Lincoln. And so he quite dramatically backs away from the great emancipator, insisting that, quote, Abraham Lincoln was not, in the fullest sense of the word, either our man or our model, in his interests, in his associations, in his habits of thought, and in his prejudices. He was a white man. He was preeminently the white man's president, entirely devoted to the welfare of white men. He was ready and willing at any time during the last years of his administration to deny, postpone, and sacrifice the rights of humanity in the colored people to promote the welfare of the white people of his country. The race to which we belong were not the special objects of his consideration. Knowing this, I concede to you, my white fellow citizens, a preeminence in this worship at once full and supreme. You are the children of Abraham Lincoln. Douglass devotes the whole of Section 3 to reassuring nervous whites who are patriotic, but probably prejudiced. Basically, he tells them, look, don't worry, Lincoln always loved you best. Take it from me, a Negro, Lincoln was not a Negro lover. It's a rather startling rhetorical gambit, but it allowed Douglass to exhort white Americans to heap high their hosannas of Lincoln. He tells them, to you it especially belongs to sound his praises, to preserve and perpetuate his memory, to multiply his statues, to hang his pictures on your walls and commend his example, for to you he was a great and glorious friend and benefactor. By the close of this section of the speech, which we might dub the white supremacist section, one might wonder why blacks are bothering to honor Lincoln at all. Douglass's answer is that while whites are Lincoln's children, blacks are his stepchildren. Children by adoption, children by force of circumstance and necessity. Moreover, what Lincoln did for his stepchildren, whether it was part of his original intention or not, was deliver them from bondage. Accordingly, Douglass entreats whites to despise not the humble offering of former slaves. The separate claims of whites and blacks upon the memory of Lincoln can coexist. Separate claims, but they can coexist. Whites can honor Lincoln for saving the Union. Blacks can honor him for emancipation. Shared homage, if it is ever to develop, must begin with toleration for racially specific homage. Frederick Douglass had a gift for metaphor, and this image of blacks as Lincoln's stepchildren, I think, is one of his finest, and it accords very nicely with Lincoln's own account of the relationship between the cause of union and the cause of emancipation, as expressed in that famous letter that Lincoln writes to Horace Greeley, a public letter. Here's how Lincoln himself explained his duty as president. My paramount object in this struggle is to save the Union, and is not either to save or to destroy slavery. If I could save the Union without freeing any slave, I would do it. If I could do it by freeing all the slaves, I would do it. And if I could save it by freeing some and leaving others alone, I would also do that. Douglass reminds his listeners that Lincoln was a Unionist first and foremost, and that he became the great emancipator only by force of circumstance and necessity. Whites ought to revere Lincoln as the savior of the nation. And indeed, the inscription on the National Lincoln Memorial, which was built half a century after the Freedmen's Memorial, that inscription reads, "In this temple, as in the hearts of the people for whom he saved the Union, the memory of Abraham Lincoln is enshrined forever." Of course, the Union to which Lincoln was devoted had as its foundation the principle of human equality. So the Union itself is a moral project. Because the bond of genuine union is a teaching about natural right, American patriotism ought to produce citizens who are, as Douglas says, friendly to the freedom of all men. And in the fourth and central section of the speech, Douglas presents at greater length the stepchildren's view of Lincoln, the essential feature of which was faith in Lincoln's living and earnest sympathy with their fate. Again, Douglas doesn't paper over the disagreements and the disappointments that blacks experienced during the war years. We were, he admits, at times stunned, grieved, and greatly bewildered. Douglas provides a litany of reasons why blacks might have doubted Lincoln's goodwill. Lincoln supported colonization schemes. He refused to enlist black troops. After he finally allowed for black recruitment, he refused to retaliate when the Confederates violated the rules of war by massacring black prisoners. And Lincoln revoked early emancipation decrees by Union generals in the field. Nonetheless, Douglas asserts that we were able to take a comprehensive view of Abraham Lincoln, a view that took the measure of the man, and after factoring in the logic of events, and even Douglas says that divinity that shapes our ends, Douglas says we came to the conclusion that the hour and the man of our redemption had met in the person of Abraham Lincoln. Douglas then gives a counter litany of the liberationist and racially transformative policies that transpired under Lincoln's rule. He lists 9 achievements, culminating in the Emancipation Proclamation. Each time, he repeats a version of the phrase, "Under his rule we saw." He's got this list of 9 things, and every time, "Under his rule we saw, under his rule we saw." I think the phrase is crucial for both blacks and whites. Blacks who longed for liberty, but who might understandably be suspicious of rule and law, having suffered under generations of misrule, they are reminded that their liberty came to them through law and through wise and beneficent rule. Conversely, whites are reminded that the actions of Lincoln, which struck not only at slavery, but also struck at prejudice and proscription, those actions were the actions of a dedicated constitutionalist. The closing paragraph of Section 4 celebrates emancipation and moreover shows that the celebration can be shared by all. Douglas asks, "Can any colored man or any white man friendly to the freedom of all men ever forget the night which followed the first day of January 1863? In other words, whites can appreciate black liberation, and blacks can appreciate white statesmanship. This is a word that Douglas now uses for the first time in the address, but not the last time. On this new biracial basis of union and liberty, Douglas goes on to a reconsideration of Lincoln in sections 5, 6, and 7. He argues that Lincoln's great and good character was transparent to those who saw him and heard him. Indeed, direct contact with Lincoln wasn't even necessary. In a passage that I think has tremendous import for us today, Douglas says, "The image of the man went out with his words, and those who read him knew him." Those who read him knew him. We're indebted to biographers and historians who have scoured and scavenged for all the bits and pieces of eyewitness testimony and hearsay evidence, who have laboriously contextualized and hypothesized and speculated to such a degree that, with the exception of Jesus, there is now no one who ever walked the earth more written about than Abraham Lincoln. Nonetheless, it's reassuring to know that Lincoln's words alone are enough. In light of this fundamentalist insight, Douglas now revises his earlier white supremacist account of Lincoln. He reconsiders Lincoln's deference to popular prejudice in the appropriate context, the context of democratic statesmanship. Here's what he says at the close of section 5. I have said that President Lincoln was a white man and shared the prejudices common to his countrymen toward the colored race. Looking back to his times and the condition of his country, this unfriendly feeling on his part may safely be set down as one element of his wonderful success in organizing the loyal American people for the tremendous conflict before them and bringing them safely through that conflict. His great mission was to accomplish two things. First, to save his country from dismemberment and ruin, and second, to free his country from the great crime of slavery. To do one or the other or both, he must have the earnest sympathy and the powerful cooperation of his loyal fellow countrymen. Without this primary and essential condition to success, his efforts must have been vain and utterly fruitless. Had he put the abolition of slavery before the salvation of the Union, he would have inevitably driven from him a powerful class of the American people and rendered resistance to rebellion impossible. Viewed from the genuine abolition ground, Mr. Lincoln seemed tardy, cold, dull, and indifferent. But measuring him by the sentiment of his country, a sentiment he was bound as a statesman to consult, he was swift, zealous, radical, and determined. Now, Frederick Douglass himself always occupied the genuine abolition ground, and his speeches and writings from the early years of the war especially often manifested great frustration with Lincoln's caution. In retrospect, however, Douglass generously acknowledges the partiality of his own abolitionist stance, and he credits Lincoln as the comprehensive statesman. The final paragraph of this section carefully distinguishes Lincoln's views on race from his views on slavery. Douglass repeats for the third time that Lincoln was prejudiced, or more precisely, that he shared the prejudices of his white fellow countrymen against the Negro. According to Douglass, this comes from other writings of his, but he's pretty clear about this, racial prejudice is just a social construct. There's nothing innate, there's nothing inevitable about it. It seems that Douglass does not regard Lincoln as particularly progressive on the question of race. He was a follower or a sharer in the dominant opinion of the day. However, in this very same section in which Douglass refers to Lincoln's prejudices, he explicitly says that, quote, the humblest could approach him and feel at home in his presence. This statement echoes what Douglass said elsewhere about the experience of being in Lincoln's personal presence. Speaking of his second meeting with Lincoln, Douglass in the autobiography says, Mr. Lincoln was not only a great president, but a great man. Too great to be small in anything. In his company, I was never in any way reminded of my humble origin or of my unpopular color. So we might wonder whether the presentation of Lincoln's racial prejudice is compatible with the presentation of his capacious and welcoming humanity. Now, of course, it might be possible for someone to regard a particular class of people as inferior in certain respects, while still treating individual members of that class with consideration. Lincoln could have been both prejudiced and polite. If so, it would still be necessary to explain why Douglass in the Oration chooses to draw attention to one quality, the prejudice, more than the other, which is what he does in all of the other writings about Lincoln, all of the other speeches about Lincoln after the war. Perhaps he wishes to indicate to both blacks and whites that racial prejudice is not an insuperable obstacle to black advancement or to bettered race relations. Alternatively, I believe it's possible to interpret Douglass's remarks in a way consistent with the view that Lincoln deferred to popular prejudice without fully subscribing to popular prejudice. The issue might be elucidated by asking, what was the nature of Lincoln's sharing in white prejudice? When he describes the relation between Lincoln and the sentiment of his country, Douglas credits Lincoln with being in advance of popular opinion, right? Measured against popular opinion, he was swift, zealous, radical, and determined. Douglas introduces the key verb consult, claiming that the sentiment of his country was something that Lincoln was bound as a statesman to consult. To the extent that popular sentiment was unfriendly to blacks, Lincoln's sharing in it may have been political rather than personal. In other words, something that he deliberately affected rather than something that was deeply held. Douglas here conveys a crucial lesson about the limits within which democratic statesmen operate. Politicians can't get too far ahead of popular opinion if they hope to remain politically viable. More than others, perhaps, black citizens must incorporate this insight into their assessment of political figures. Okay. What does it mean to take a comprehensive view? A comprehensive view must, Douglas says, quote, make reasonable allowance for the circumstances and not judge on the basis of stray utterances or isolated facts. In taking the measure of Lincoln, Douglas shows how granting this latitude of maneuver is compatible with respect for the burdens of statesmanship or the limits of statesmanship, but also compatible with the self-respect of citizens, of black citizens. However one might come down on this question of Lincoln's views on race, Douglas is emphatic that Lincoln's attitude towards slavery was above reproach. Douglas quotes from the Atonement passage in the second inaugural, in which Lincoln interpreted the Civil War as the blood price exacted by a just God for the nation's sins toward the slave. You all remember the passage, right? It speaks of the war possibly continuing until all the wealth piled by the bondsmen's 250 years of unrequited toil shall be sunk, and until every drop of blood drawn with the lash shall be paid by another drawn with the sword. Those were lines that Douglas quoted in nearly every post-war speech that mentioned Lincoln. The second inaugural solemn invocation of divine reparations, Douglas says, gives all needed proof of Lincoln's feeling on the subject of slavery. Douglas now revisits an issue that he had highlighted earlier. In Section 3, when he mentioned Lincoln's policy of opposition to the extension of slavery, he had stressed Lincoln's willingness to protect, defend, and perpetuate slavery in the states where it existed, right? Lincoln's only opposed to extending slavery. He says he's going to leave slavery alone in the slave states. That tolerance of slavery in the South was earlier cited by Douglas as evidence of Lincoln's pro-white views. Now, however, in Section 5, Douglas explains that Lincoln acted as he did, not because he was indifferent to the fate of black slaves, but because he, quote, thought it was so nominated in the bond. In other words, he was bound by the Constitution. Right? He acted out of fidelity to the Constitution. Lincoln's pre-war willingness to leave slavery alone in the southern states does not in any way disprove or lessen his anti-slavery convictions. Now, of course, Douglas himself actually disagreed with Lincoln about what precisely the Constitution required, what was nominated in the bond. Most notably, Douglas argued that the so-called fugitive slave clause of the Constitution did not, in fact, refer to slaves, but referred instead to indentured servants who had signed contracts and could be held to those legal terms. Nonetheless, even though he's not fully in accord with Lincoln's reading of the document, Douglas moves his audience toward an appreciation of constitutional devotion. He's acutely aware that racial progress in the future will depend upon the fidelity of both blacks and whites to the Constitution as purified and completed by the 13th, 14th, and 15th Amendments. Fittingly, Sections 6 and 7 of the speech transcend race altogether. These are the only sections that make no reference to either blacks or whites. Section 6 describes Lincoln's early years, his preparation through plain speaking and plain dealing for the great crisis of Civil War. Douglas emphasizes Lincoln's humble origins. A son of toil himself, he was linked in brotherly sympathy with the sons of toil in every loyal part of the Union. In this section, racial division is overcome and replaced by the class division between the patrician, James Buchanan, who was willing to allow national dismemberment, and the plebeian, Abraham Lincoln, who had an oath in heaven to preserve, protect, and defend the Constitution of the United States. So the division that we ought to dwell on, Douglas implies, is that between patriotism and treason. This theme reaches its apotheosis in Section 7, which describes the assassination of Abraham Lincoln. Despite the hell-black spirit of revenge that motivated the crime, Douglas argues that good has come from it. Dying as a martyr to union and liberty, those twin aims now conjoined and equal, Lincoln has become doubly dear to us. In his autobiography, Douglas noted that one effect of the assassination was to bring him into close accord with his white neighbors. He said he felt for the first time more like kin than countrymen after the assassination of Lincoln. In the final section of the speech, which is just one paragraph in length, Douglas comes full circle, speaking once more to his largely black audience. He tells them, in doing honor to the memory of our friend and liberator, we have been doing highest honor to ourselves and those who come after us. So note that despite the unfriendly feeling ascribed to Lincoln in both sections 3 and 5, Lincoln, by the end of the speech, has become our friend. Through his interpretation and masterful presentation of Lincoln's statesmanship, Douglas has knit together the American polity in mutual understanding and appreciation of Lincoln. And I think Douglas has acted as a statesman himself by demonstrating how memory and memorialization, done well, might shape a post-racial future. Let me just leave you with his picture of that American future. This is in 1863. He's in the midst of Civil War, and yet he is already looking forward to a time when, quote, the white and colored people of this country will be blended into a common nationality and enjoy together in the same country, under the same flag, the inestimable blessings of life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness as neighborly citizens of a common country. Thanks.
I am Kyler Smith. I will moderate the question and answer session. Kyler will help me do this. Please raise a hand if you have questions for Professor Schaub, and we will bring a microphone to you.
Hello, Professor Shaw. My name is Pedro. I'm one of the students in the Douglas Baldwin class. And you mentioned in the beginning about this idea of like national mythology towards Abraham Lincoln. Do you think that concept in itself is healthy, or what are your thoughts in that part?
A worship of Abraham Lincoln? Mm-hmm. All to the good. Yeah, but I mean, I think Douglas is doing a couple of things here. I mean, he wants the nation to be united in its admiration of Lincoln, but he doesn't want it to be idolatry. And so that's part of that purpose of that earlier section where he's saying, you know, no politician is perfect. We don't regard democratic statesmen as gods. We want to be aware of what we approved of and what we didn't approve of. So I do think in a way what he's doing, he's sort of modeling for his fellow black citizens, how do you assess a political figure? And especially how do we as minorities assess these political figures who come from the dominant group? So I think it's a kind of lesson in that assessment, and one that's still good for us today. And it does seem to me, though, that it has led to a lot of misunderstanding or misrepresentation of this speech. So there are some people who just take that third section, the attack on Lincoln, and say, Lincoln bad. But you've got to read the entire speech. You've got to see that it's an unfolding argument. So the rhetoric of the speech is actually very sophisticated.
I think I'm next. So maybe we can combine one of the themes of the first paper or the first talk and this. So Lincoln on intermarriage. Could you maybe sketch out what you think Lincoln may have thought on that and why he may have thought it at whatever point he thought it?
Well, I think he's pretty clear on this from the beginning. His vision of the American future is a radically integrationist vision. Because he believed that prejudice was something temporary, something that could be overcome, he thought that as we move in that direction, once the laws are not discriminatory and once these prejudices start to fade, that then affection will be free to follow its dictates, and that the natural result of that is that people will marry on the basis of attraction and shared interests. And so he was quite certain that when that comes to be the case, that those color lines will disappear. He is also, I think, throughout, a quite profound critic of race pride. So when he talks about how he feels about his own blackness, he says that's it's not a proper source of pride. Pride can attach only to what you achieve yourself through your virtues, through your character. It can't attach to something that is a gift. I mean, he says whatever we receive from God, we should welcome, and it's a gift, but you can't take pride in it. So he also thinks that as a strategy for blacks, race pride is not going to work. He says, what is the mountain lion in our midst? It's white pride. That is the mountain lion in our midst. He says you can't fight the Beelzebub with some other demon. You have to take the high moral ground. And for him, the high moral ground is always just the ground of humanity. It seems to me he regards color as just a matter of how much melatonin is in your skin. He says humanity is the only thing that is universal, and he looks toward a time where people will act on that.
I just stole this from Forrest because I meant to ask about Lincoln's view on intermarriage, and I must have misspoken.
Okay, so you already were clear on Douglas's views.
No, I was glad to hear it.
Okay, yeah, okay, all right, I'll start over. We start over.
I figured since you intermarried, you're probably pro.
Yeah, Lincoln on intermarriage is much trickier because he does have to pay this deference to public opinion, which, of course, white public opinion is virulently opposed to intermarriage. You can see it in the way he has to counter Stephen Douglas. Lincoln says all men are created equal, right? Entitled to these natural rights. Stephen Douglas says, well, if that's what you Republicans think, the logical terminus of that view, what that view really amounts to, is my daughter is going to bring home a Negro. Right? That's what it really means. It means intermarriage. And so Lincoln has to backpedal away from that logical terminus. And he has to say, no, we're not talking about social equality. Social equality is just a code word for intermarriage. During this period. He has to say, no, we're not talking about social equality. We're not even talking about political equality. We're not talking about the vote. We're not talking about suffrage. We are just talking about the need for this nation to put slavery in the course of ultimate extinction. So it seems to me that Lincoln knows that that is a fight for a later day, and he just has to refocus Americans' attention towards their natural hostility to slavery. He has to evoke that feeling. You have to win that battle first. You have to win the battle against slavery, taking over the nation, extending into the territories. You have to win that battle first. So I think it's very difficult to get a full read on Lincoln's views on intermarriage, because he only speaks on it when absolutely pressed to do so. And when absolutely pressed to do so, he always says, no, I'm not proposing any changes there. I guess the only other thing I would say is you can see the trajectory of his thinking about race in his eventual embrace of at least a qualified suffrage for the new freedmen.
It's true that Scott stole the microphone, so guard your cookies at lunch. Just parenthetically on that, Diane, I think unless my memory is fading, I think that at one of the debates that Douglas was actually there, and that during the debate, Stephen Douglas makes reference to the fact that Frederick Douglass was there in the context of talking about miscegenation.
Yeah, they're always trying to create this linkage between the abolitionists and the Republicans. That is what the Democrats' strategy. And so they're constantly talking about, Fred Douglass and his amalgamationism.
Yeah, that would be interesting to think about that in relation to Frederick Douglass.
Yeah, very difficult. Here we've got Stephen Douglas and we've got Frederick Douglass. One is Douglas with 2 S's, the other is Douglas with 1 S. Grounds for failing the course on the final exam. If you mix the two of them up, even if you mix up the spelling of their names. Sorry, go ahead.
Well, my original question was, you mentioned that in his speech, Frederick Douglass had said that not just black Americans had been emancipated, but white Americans too. And I wonder if he was not only thinking about, the master class being liberated from their vices, but also the very real tyranny over the majority of the whites in the South, and if he had expounded on that. Because I know that before the war, Frederick Douglass had spoken about that. And the abolitionists in upstate New York had been really the leaders in the critique of Southern government in the early going. I'm wondering if he had talked more about that in that speech.
In which speech? In the oration, or?
Yes.
No, not explicitly, although with that reference to Buchanan and sort of this patrician side of things, I think it is a kind of reference to that. But certainly there are plenty of other speeches where he talks about what Reconstruction ought to look like, and I do think it's. I mean, your comment is a very helpful one, that there are 2 forms of enslavement, or the legacies of enslavement, that have to be addressed. So there's the legacy of enslavement among blacks and what's necessary to transform them, right, the kind of education that's necessary. But there is also a needed transformation among whites. And part of that is maybe economic and involve governmental institutions, but a large part of it is transformation of the heart and addressing discrimination and prejudice. In a way, Booker T. Washington sort of takes up this theme in the way in which he reaches out to white bigots and says that he feels a kind of pity for them, that they, in a way, experience a more devastating form of enslavement than the freedmen.
Hello, Professor Schaub. My name's Jade. I'm also taking the class with Pedro. My question to you is, can you give me a little more elaboration on what you mean by radically integrationist? I don't really understand the radical portion, but I do understand the integration portion. So if you can elaborate more on that.
All I mean, I guess by saying radical is thoroughgoing. In other words, he looks toward a time where certainly laws will not have any kind of racial coding or creating any sort of categories, separate categories. But he also looks toward a time in which people will really not see race. And he also thinks that as we move towards a situation in which you don't see race, that actually the races themselves will, if intermarriage becomes more common, he actually speaks about a new composite American nationality. And in a way, he himself is a kind of exemplar of it. He not only has a black heritage and a white heritage, but he claimed also a Native American heritage. So he regards himself as a kind of, as a compound of America's three races. So he thinks eventually that's what America will look like. So he predicts that in this little piece called Our Composite American Nationality. That's his prediction for the long-term American future. By the way, in your class, had you read the Oration?
Yes, we have.
Yeah. Oh, good.
It's quite interesting that you bring that up. We just read that last week. But he talks mostly about Chinese immigration into.
Not in the Oration on Lincoln. You may be thinking of the 1880 Emancipation Day address.
The composite nationality address, I think.
Oh, in that one, yeah. No, he's also, yes, as after the war, he's already thinking about other sort of venues of American discrimination, and so he's interested in questions of immigration and the status of Jews, the status of the Chinamen.
I'm an interloper from the English department here at Linfield, and so all of you historians and political scientists excuse potential ignorance of my question here. Had the decision already been made to pull the federal troops out of the South at the time he gave the speech? And where is U.S. Grant? Is he at this dedication?
This would be after Grant already. This is 1876, so
Right,
after
that.
Grant. And yeah. Oh, I'm sorry. Oops. I'm very bad on dates. I'm a political philosopher, not a. So Grant is the president who's present. So another historian. Are the troops already withdrawn or? Not all of them. No. But the scale back is clear, right? And so Douglas is aware that this is a very dicey moment. And so he's looking for. I mean, he's probably not going to get anywhere just calling for continued federal intervention in the South, and he's thinking of other strategies and ways to build a united nation.
And was Grant at this dedication?
Yes, he was. Yes.
What was the relationship between those two men?
That I don't know much about. There are other people here who could answer that. Is Grant the one who appoints him to David?
Well, Grant gave him his first federal appointment to the Santo Domingo Commission as a secretary in 1870-71. They had a good, solid, but largely distant relationship, but he campaigned for Grant vehemently. And Grant pulled the cord unveiling this monument that day. I looked in vain in the Grant papers for some...
any mention of it?
Yeah, I wanted to know, what did Grant think of this thing? But there's nothing there. Grant may have gone back and had a cigar and taken a nap, for all I know. But I thought your talk was brilliant. That speech is a rhetorical masterpiece. I think it's the second greatest speech. It still can't top the 4th of July. But the sections of that speech, the way you moved through that, the use of the stepchild, and then finally to say, as a refrain, as you pointed out, that emancipation came under his rule and in due time, meaning Lincoln. It was as though he's saying the country and the war freed the slaves. And you people out here, the Supreme Court, the Congress, the President, all of you are here, you still got to make it. stick. And it's, as you said, at the very moment Reconstruction has fallen to pieces, that speech is a great plea for hanging on to Reconstruction when it's dying.
Yeah, and Douglas knew also that this was a special moment. He had the largest audience that he had ever had. Right. So the fact that all of official Washington is present, right, and that this is going, and it's a federal holiday, this is going to be widely reported. In his autobiography, he talks about the significance of that moment, to have that joint audience, a large black audience and an official governmental white audience was a very key moment. He knew it.
I think I'm up next.
Yeah.
Thanks for the gripping analysis of the speech. I really appreciated it. My question it concerns the way in which you detail the complexity of the speech, the way in which he appeals so carefully to two different audiences. My question basically concerns the complexity of that rhetoric. And do you think that the very complexity of the rhetoric, or what effect, less leading question would be, what effect does the complexity have on its effectiveness as rhetoric? I know it's a great moment and it's a difficult time and he's treading very carefully, but I guess when I read the speech, I wonder how effective it could be at accomplishing his ends outside of your kind of dissection. Does that make sense?
Yeah, people used to be better readers, and they used to be better listeners. So, but it's also the case. I mean, it is interesting to look at Douglas's speeches because often he would be speaking. You know, he might be speaking to a black audience, or he would be speaking to a white audience, and so he can target the message to those specific audiences. Now, they're also published. He knows that they'll be available for others to read, but this would be an instance where he's got to speak to multiple audiences at the same time. Now, maybe that just means that different audiences hear what they want, right? And that would be fine, right? But I do think he is trying to move the audience. So he starts by telling whites, yeah, Lincoln is yours, and therefore you should celebrate him, and go ahead and celebrate him for a union, and don't worry if you don't say so much about emancipation. I mean, I do think that's a really important moment in the speech. There can be racially specific appreciation of Lincoln, but Douglas is not content to leave it there. I mean, he would not want that to remain the long-term prospect. So I think even if you're not aware of how the rhetoric operates, the force of the speech moves you to a different place. So that as a white person listens to that, he then hears, or any man friendly to the freedom of all men. There's some resonance. He's able to create that resonance, and partly because he's good with the English language, right? So I think it works even if you don't understand how it's working. And that's true of Lincoln's rhetoric also. You know, the Gettysburg Address or the second inaugural. It's wonderful to analyze it. It's wonderful to understand how it operates, but it has power regardless of whether you're aware of those tricks of the trade.
Thank you. Yeah. So I wanted to say I appreciate your kind of tracking of the friends or fellow citizens, the you and the our. Like, I think those moves are really important throughout the piece. And that was really helpful for me, your careful attention to that. And I wanted to see if you could say a little more about your interpretation. It was actually the part of the speech you're just talking about right now, where you said that Douglas didn't want Lincoln to, that a black embrace of Lincoln would trigger a white flight from Lincoln. And so I hear you reading that as a kind of political appeal to white people, to say, don't worry, he was a white man's president. And in a way, like protecting white identifications with Lincoln so they could see themselves in Lincoln. And so it just really comes up for me as like the constraints of that appeal. And I wonder if there's a way to hear it in a different way, is not a reassurance to the white people, but an intervention in this moment of memorializing and remembering and delivering a kind of a warning or signaling a danger, the fraughtness, the impasse. And so just
Can you tell me what you mean by a warning?
A warning to maybe to Black listeners in the audience, or to mark the Lincoln's racism rather than a reassurance to white listeners that they could, maintain racism and protect their celebration of Lincoln in a certain kind of way.
I'm just not quite sure that I understand you. I mean, I do think he is, yes, telling blacks we don't want to turn our admiration for Lincoln into something more than it ought to be.
Yeah.
And so is that what you mean, a kind of warning that there can be a less attractive side to political figures?
I think it's about the difference between understanding, is he giving a warning, and or is it possible to be giving that warning and also to be protecting an image of Lincoln, discouraging white flight from Lincoln? Or what are the constraints of that particular move in the speech?
Yeah. So are you saying you think that he is not sort of reassuring whites? I mean, I do think he's genuinely worried about this, and you can see a shift. A couple of speeches that he gave right after the assassination, where he says that Lincoln was emphatically the black man's president. Like the first president that blacks can lay claim to. He says emphatically the black man's president. He says that right after the assassination. That's a moment in which he can say that, I think. In those same speeches, he also makes clear that he's also the white man's president. He's both. But by this point now, I think the situation has become more, it's more grim, right? And so he needs to make sure that whites hang on to Lincoln. There is so much that tends toward the good in Lincoln and Lincoln's legacy. So he wants to make sure that whites don't regard Lincoln as too radical, as having gone too far in this direction. And so he really wants to stress, Lincoln was the white man's president, preeminently the white man's president. So I do think he is really worried that if blacks lay too strong a claim to Lincoln, that whites will say, well, all right, and therefore Lincoln bad. Right? So that's why I do think, but that's also why that's the beginning of the speech, and it's not where the speech ends up.
All right, we have time for one last question. This gentleman in the back here.
Here you go. Can you tell us anything about the history of the statue after the speech?
Oh,
because,
well, yeah.
I mean, it must be one of the most neglected monuments in Washington.
Yeah, if it set people off at the time, it sets people off even more now, right? You can see why there might be objections to the statue. So it did, though, for many years remain the site of black gatherings in celebration of emancipation. So there were annual gatherings that would have been held at the statue.
On January 1st or on April 15th?
I'm not sure about that. As I say, dates, not my strong suit. Okay. So, but that started to fade, and certainly by the 1960s, nobody wants to come anywhere near this statue. Yeah.
All right, please join me in thanking Professor Schaub for her presentation. All right, we'll now have a 45-minute break so we can get lunch before the next lecture from David Blight from Yale. His presentation will start at